And I think we are live. If that's accurate. So, hello. I would be surprised if anyone's watching now because we're just starting off, but welcome. And the camera's working. Mic is the right mic, I think. Yes. Excellent. Got my new headphones. I'm just going to shut that door behind me. And hello. I've got one viewer, early viewer, so welcome. Hi, Mum, as well, on the Zoom call. Welcome back, everyone. We're in January. I'm just going to pin myself and later spotlight myself. And it's good to be back in the past, that is. It's been a while. I took a break. I needed to take a break. It was Christmas and New Year's. Spent some time with family. I hope everyone else had a good bit of time off. As much as possible. Obviously, it's kind of rough right now, but I hope everyone's doing well. Let's just say that, shall we? And let's see. I don't believe anyone else is trying to join. That's good. See if people watch on YouTube or Zoom more. There's always a bit of a competition. Let's see who we get more of. And as time ticks on, this will be a bit of a, I'm not sure who I'm talking to. This will be a bit of a shorter one, actually, as it's just conceptual. Only 20 minutes while we discuss the themes and concepts and all the other complex stuff surrounding what we're about to dive into. This is the introduction, after all. And I'm going to increase that size. 5 minutes out. I hope we'll get a good showing. Just got an Ed Ball style message from someone there. And I've got my wine. If no one else shows up, I'll be having a couple more of those. We'll see how we do. With 5 minutes to go. I hope people are excited to be back. Should be a good one, I hope. This is drawing much more on the history that I've done at university. I didn't do very much, really barely any at all, European history in my time at uni. But now I've done a lot of American history. And if all those years are worth it at all, well, we're going to find out in the next 4 minutes / months as we go through these talks. And the time is approaching. And I hope that's all right. Mum, as you're the only person watching currently, I think I can share this with you. I got an email from Maeve that just said Maeve and nothing else. I'm not sure what's up with that, if that's on purpose or not. But hello, Lita.
Okay, I think she was going to try and join, and I thought I sent her the links. Okay, let me try and see if I can do something.
See, I don't know what that would mean. I was sending an email with just her name and not the text, but we'll find out. Okay. I suppose. So, with 3 minutes to go. People are now trickling in. Good. I always get slightly worried in this intermediary period that just no one will show up. But we got audience, so all's well. Welcome.
Hello, Lucas. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Nita. How are you doing?
Can you see me?
No, I've turned off video for.
Oh, you turned
participants.
off video.
Yeah,
Okay.
I thought because this is being streamed on YouTube for who knows to look at. So I think it's, I don't know. I'm fine with my face being plastered across the internet, but if you don't want yours, that's understandable.
Okay, that's better. Then I can, yeah. Okay, that's lovely. So I'm muted for the moment
Cool.
as well.
Are you going to mute us, Lucas? Okay.
Before we kick off, I'll hit it with a mute.
Okay.
But it's all right for now. I'm expecting some interesting discussion. This is the kind of stuff that a lot of these things we've actually been talking about in seminars recently as well, and there'll be some. I don't know. I hope it's going to be good. It's going to be, as I said, a little bit shorter. It's going to be around 20-25 minutes. Last time I timed it, I might go off on tangents and all that kind of thing, but I'm fine with it being a bit shorter because it's just conceptual. It's not a full. This is a story about history that takes half an hour to tell. It's just the introductory bit. But I'm glad everyone's getting it. As I said, this is just talk zero. So a little amuse-bouche, aperitif starter for the main course in 2 weeks. But that's all right. With 2 minutes to go, we're getting ready. Hope everyone's got a beverage of their choice, be it alcoholic or non-alcoholic, while they're waiting. And even, you know what, while you're watching as well, there's no reason why I can't enjoy yourself, whatever it is that you may be drinking. And yeah, it's a bit of a dreary January that I'm finishing off here with this talk, but I hope that, I don't know, I can provide some degree of entertainment, and we'll continue to throughout the rest of the year. I considered, there's enough content that I consider doing it weekly, but God, there's no way I have enough time. I've got a master's to do in this time. So we'll see what happens after that, though. If these continues to get an audience, then there's no reason why I won't continue to do them. That's exciting. With just 1 minute to do, I'm going to share my screen and bring up the video. Let me just tab out and then do the whole finicky thing that needs to happen. It is this that we want. Lovely. You can see, and the time is now past. We'll see if we get a last minute stream in of people or not. Yes, we did. Okay, I'll just admit everyone and then mute all and then kick off. And welcome everyone. I can vamp for a little bit longer as I'm not really pushed for time at all here. Welcome everyone back. It's good to be back. I'm happy to be talking to the camera again. I hope you're happy to see me, and I hope that everyone's doing well and right. And I'm now going to start, I suppose. And this is basically, as I say here, the introductory bit. This is the talk zero before we kick off with the main course of this series. But it is very important, I think, to talk about the themes, the concepts, the language, this background bit of information. I think we do really have to do. And also I think it's quite interesting as well. So this should still be, I think, a good talk. Maybe a little bit high concept, a little bit high level, but don't worry, we'll get down to back to basics starting in 2 weeks' time. And let's look at the introduction. So I've got a picture of Martin Luther King here, because when you talk about Black history, every year, different months in different countries, there is a Black History Month. And I would say Martin Luther King is probably the largest figure in the popular imagination of Black history, is the person that everyone's heard of. So I want to have him up here in the introduction, but of course we'll be talking about a lot more than just that. And there'll be 3 parts to this talk. It'll be a 3-act play. And the first act is what my seminar tutors call the who cares question. So why is it worth doing Black history at all? And I think there are a number of reasons why it's worth doing, and I'm going to talk about those for a bit. And then move on to the, I guess, table of contents. We're going to talk about what we're going to be talking about in the later talks. I said the word talk way too many times there, but we'll set out what the themes we're going to look at are, and what important historical bits, and where we're going to be talking about, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, and possibly even most importantly, we're going to talk about how we can do it properly, because this is still very much a contentious topic. The issues that we are discussing still affect people today. So I think there are certain things to bear in mind and suggestions as well for how we can do this in a rigorous and compassionate way. Those are the two main things I want to do. I want us to all be doing together. We're all historians here. We're going to be doing good history, but we're going to be doing good history. We're going to be doing it in such a way that's kind and thoughtful and accurate as well. So, question one, why Black history, right? And I should say that I am in my second year of university. I did a module that was, I think, entitled Introduction to American History. And the lecturer, she began the first talk of the series by standing at the lectern and saying, I am going to make this argument for the rest of the module to you, that the history of America is the history of its Black subjects and citizens. And this kind of blew my mind a bit. But as the module went on, I found her arguments extremely persuasive, and I'm going to be making those arguments later on in this talk. And she claimed that everything from the revolution to the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement to the westward expansion to even the first British colonies on American soil and other European colonies as well were defined by the relation between the white and Black subjects. And before I get into that, really, I guess it's worth pointing out that history, as I said before, history is 5-dimensional. That's a lot. Well, the first three, what do I mean by that? The first 3 dimensions are the usual ones, length, height, width. The physical dimensions. When we talk about history, we need to talk about a certain place. Most of the time, almost always. There's asterisks to everything. But for the most part, when someone is writing a history book, they'll focus on one area. So if you're doing history of Henry VIII, your area is England, right? This one, the area is primarily the US. We'll talk a little bit about the wider Americas in general, but mostly the US is our physical dimensions. The 4th dimension is time. That makes sense too, right? You have to have a time frame for almost every history that exists. And this one will be from the kind of first colonies in the Americas until pretty much to this day. Anyone that's been following the news at all for the last year knows that history is being made all the time, and particularly Black history is being made all the time. And I suspect you might actually get a bit of a tortoise and hare type thing. As I keep going, the history keeps catching up and new very interesting things keep happening that are worth talking about. Maybe this will never end, but we'll see. And the last lecture series, the Romantic Europe, Germanic Europe, that was maybe like a 2,000-year long time frame, very, very broad. This one's quite a lot tighter. It's like a quarter of that length. We're only talking about 400 years of history here. And also it's much more, for the most part, geographically constrained, mostly just the US. But then there's the 5th dimension, and that is the lens through which you view history. There are lots of lenses that you can look at history through. And the lens, a historical lens, is a way of, I guess, narrowing your scope so that you can tell one coherent story rather than being overwhelmed with all these different stories that are worth telling. For example, there you could do transnational history. So you're studying Europe over 100 years and you're looking at the relations between countries and intellectual movements between countries. That's transnational. You could do an economic history and you're focusing on trade relations and the rise of industry and capitalism and all that kind of stuff. That's a classic sort of economic history lens. Or one that I'm studying this year for my master's, and I've studied that undergrad as well, is gender history. We had one talk on that last season, I guess, and it was fairly popular actually. And that is looking at history through the lens of the relation between men and women and other sexuality and gender categories, and focusing on, the history of women. A lot of is what gender history does, and talks about what it was like for women. It's in the same place and over the same time period, but we're just looking at different stories and looking at different people in particular. Well, this one is Black history. A racial lens is another very popular kind of lens that you can use. And it's not without controversy. There are some historians, in fact, there are some historians who are themselves Black, who say that it's not very useful. for certain places, not necessarily the US. And I think it is particularly useful for the US because race relations define America in so many ways that we're going to talk about. And when you do a Black history, you are focusing primarily on the Black people in the society, as well as their relation to the dominant social category. That's what it means to do Black history. And why do it? Well, I think it's important stories to be told, but also I think it's really, really interesting. And this was a campaign by Amnesty International I got a poster for here that makes the same argument, basically, that all these different countries and nations and people, their history is often very, very, very influenced by the relation to Black citizens and Black subjects within these societies. Not to say that it's separate. In fact, they are one and the same. But I think this is a very, very good lens through which to view it. And if that was very high concept and didn't make much sense, please ask me more. I think we can have a really interesting discussion after this talk in the questions on the YouTube Live and on the Zoom call as well. So yes, I do think it's interesting. And I want to show this picture as well as another introductory piece, because maybe secondary to Martin Luther King, but one of the other biggest things that people often think about when they think about Black history is the history of slavery and the slave trade. And that is very, very important, and we'll be talking about it a lot, but I want to have a look at the preconceptions that people might have about this. This image was used by the British Abolitionist Society to argue for the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery in general. And it depicts a Black man, and he is barely wearing clothes, right? He's wearing, has a sheet wrapped around his genitals, and he is kneeling, he's in chains, and he's supplicant. And he says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And he is portrayed in this way as passive and desperate for the assistance of the white people, the white abolitionists. And that was the dominant view for a very, very long time in the scholarship. And I think a lot of people still really think that today. If you don't, great, because I also don't think this, that slavery ended when white people gave Black people their freedom, right? And it's this kind of misconception that we want to, that we're going to be breaking down as one of the many topics that we're going to be talking about, because this kind of thing ignores, for example, the many, many, many slave revolts that took place, or other kinds of resistance to slavery that happened from the bottom, not from the white abolitionists, but from the Black people themselves, the enslaved people themselves, and how they resisted these oppressive networks. And that is this kind of thing that we're going to be challenging. And I basically want you to almost clear your mind and forget what preconceptions you might have as we discuss. And these are in chronological order, the broad topics. But I think each one of these merits several talks. And we're going to try and have a lot deeper rather than the broad brushstrokes from the Romantic Europe, Germanic Europe here. And this means British colonialism, other European countries as well, but mostly the British colonialism into North America. And then after colonialism, you have the American Revolution and the early American Republic. And that also means the westward expansion of the American Republic. Then we have the Civil War, obviously very, very defined by slavery and the racial relations in the US, right? That's the primary reason why the southern states seceded, is over slavery. Then after that, there's a period that is often, I think, very, very almost criminally under-discussed, which is the Reconstruction period, when the North was occupying the South and trying to rebuild it in such a way that gave the Black citizens of the US a future. And the reasons, we're going to talk about why it failed and how it succeeded and all that kind of stuff. And then after that, we're going to look at the Civil Rights era. So that period from the kind of 40s to the 60s and even 70s and maybe even 80s as well, when there's Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, all these kind of titans of the Black history that people really think about when they think about this topic. We're going to be talking about that as well. And then after that, we're going to talk about the modern period, the 90s and the noughties, and like the last 10 years because a lot of really interesting things have been happening that I would still class as Black history, even though they're very, very recent. We're going to try and look at them together like historians and maybe have some really good discussions about them as well. And yes, as I said before, the geographic scope, it is primarily the USA that we're going to be talking about. But I will do a talk on the Haitian Revolution. There's other things as well that are interesting that we're going to talk about in broader terms, but I will do a talk on the Haitian Revolution and no one can stop me because it is amazingly interesting. It is arguably the only, certainly the first, really successful revolt by enslaved people where they really took their own freedom. As we'll see in the next slide, I think there's a painting, or maybe a couple of slides on. And it's so fascinating what happened and the successes and failures and that kind of stuff. So there's going to be a little bit of the wider Atlantic and American struggle. There's maybe even going to be some discussion of Africa, the continent itself, and what was happening there in relation to the Americas. But the focus will primarily be on the US. There'll be other topics as well. But as you can see by the kind of the chronological, like, important points that we're talking about here on the scale, it's mostly the US that we're going to be talking about. But we talked about what we're going to talk about, and now we should talk about how we're going to talk about it. Because as you can see from this painting of the Haitian Revolution, various things are going on, and it's certainly very contentious. And we need to be careful. And there are three ways, well, there are three kind of points to this overall topic. Firstly, I'm going to say explicitly, I am white, and I think most of my audience is as well. And we are going to be discussing non-white history. And we need to say a few words about how to do that, and can we or should we do that? And I think we can and should, but I'm going to talk, there's definitely points to be made about this. Secondly, we're going to be talking about how to use language accurately and also sensitively and things like that. And then finally, there's a few other points to keep in mind that I'm going to mention as well. So firstly, white discussions of non-white history. The first question is, has it been done? And it is certainly true that for a very long period of time, there was very little effort by historians in the dominant social groups, aka white people, to really write the histories and tell the stories of non-white people. There's a historian I read recently, in fact, from the 19th century, who said that there can never be a history of Black people because they have no history. This is obviously extremely racist, right? No surprise. And it fell to Black scholars and other scholars of ethnic minority groups to write their own histories and tell these stories. For example, W.E. Du Bois, who's pictured here, was an American sociologist and historian who wrote these histories. And it was often people talking about their own families and their own pasts and the pasts of their own families that really started the movement towards any kind of Black history taking place in the scholarship at all. So that begs the question of, these people have lived experiences and therefore have quite possibly much better understandings of, obviously they have much better understandings of what it's like to be a Black person. And therefore they likely know, they just have more nuance and have more experience and therefore can write the history better, probably, right? That makes perfect sense, doesn't it? So that begs the question that even though the white historians haven't done it for so long, should they now come around and write histories of Black people? Do they have any right to? Because they haven't got this experience and it's been this neglected topic. Should it be done? And I would say yes on 2 points. I think there's a very valid question. Don't just completely dismiss those questions. But I think there are the reason why I'm going to do it, at least, that there are two things that I would like to say. This is a second part of the who cares question that we had earlier, is why should I do it specifically? And the first one is that I'm not writing histories in this case. And in fact, almost all of the sources that I'm going to be using, primary and secondary, in fact, the distinction being that, incidentally, primary sources are the sources that were created at the time. So, for example, someone's diary that they wrote when they were experiencing slavery or oppression, or a wooden bowl that someone ate out of 200 years ago that historians and archaeologists can now take and analyze the contents and work out what kind of food people ate. That's the primary source, right? Secondary sources are books written as histories by historians. And the two can overlap and blur and merge. It's all complicated, but that's kind of a distinction. Almost all of the secondary sources that I'm going to be using are written by Black authors. So I'm going to be using those experiences and those nuanced understandings as evidence for when I'm talking about the history to you guys. And that way, I guess I can sidestep around and just let their voices speak, if that makes sense, and let them tell these interesting stories and just relating them to you, because people tend not to read. Random normal people don't read academic books, right? Why the hell would you? I have to, as part of my degree, so I might as well use those really interesting discussions and kind of spread them around and spread them down here. And that comes to the second point. Why do I feel the need to do it now? Because it's the thing that I'm really, really passionate about in history. It's the topic that I love, and it's the thing I spent the last 4 years studying. And I just think that these stories are so interesting and so worthwhile and so important that they can't not be told. And if I'm going to talk about history, this is the kind of history that I'm going to talk about. And if that's not a satisfying answer, then please leave comments, say stuff in the discussion afterwards, because I'd love to have this debate. I'd love to talk about this. I think it is really important. Apart from that point, let's talk about the use of language, because a lot of the sources, even some of the secondary sources that are older, use words that are now considered slurs, particularly racial slurs. I want to say now explicitly that I will never say any of these out loud, of course, nor will I ever put them on the screen. If I'm quoting stuff at length, I would just say, they say a racial slur here, and then continue. Because firstly, they make me very uncomfortable. And secondly, I don't know, but I'm fairly certain that a lot of my audience will be made quite uncomfortable by the discussion and use of them, right? And the mention of them as well. And I would ask, I always want to have a really good discussion in the comments and stuff afterwards, but that means I want it to be good as well. And I'd ask you guys when you're asking questions and stuff, please don't use slurs. I hope that goes without saying, obviously, but just in case it doesn't, even when we're like quoting people and that kind of stuff, please just don't use slurs. It's all good. And then we can be happy. And the same goes for using accurate terms to describe people. There are lots of different terms that have been used to describe Black people, particularly in the Americas. So African Americans, people of color, colored people was a kind of out of date one that people wouldn't really use anymore. Blacks, some Americans still say, which makes me kind of uncomfortable. I don't love it that much. I use Black people, and I think that that's fine. If someone is uncomfortable with that, tell me and we can talk about it. And the same goes for, I talk about enslaved people rather than slaves for kind of the same reason, that I worry that some of these other terms are a bit dehumanizing. And I think it's worth mentioning that these people, no matter what their race or labor situation, anything like that, they are still people. And it's important not to forget the human element in all these historical discussions, right? These are people at the end of the day. And I worry that if you say slaves rather than enslaved people, I know it seems like a really minor point, but they are not defined by their slave status. They were free in some cases before, and in other cases they were later free, and they were many other things as well as being enslaved. And so I think it's really, really important to remember the human element and remember that these are people who have these issues, have these struggles, and are historical actors. But at the end of the day, everyone's still people, right? On the other hand, for other people, there is a really big debate that has been happening really a lot, if anyone remembers, since last summer, right? About whether we as historians, I like to think that everyone here, we're all historians together, can we pass moral judgment on historical actors? And again, I would love to hear your thoughts afterwards on this topic, because people that we're talking about and that we will talk about in the rest of these talks will do stuff that by modern standards is awful, really, really terrible. There are some really nasty stuff that people did in the past. And that's true of any history. People do terrible things all the time. I have been trained as a historian to never pass moral judgment on historical actors and say, I've been told that we cannot judge people in historical times by the standards of today. And someone like, for example, Edward Colston, who was a figure in Bristolian history in Bristol. And he had been a philanthropist and a merchant, and he had really been involved in the Atlantic slave trade. And a statue had been put up to him in Bristol celebrating his philanthropy. But once the Black Lives Matter movement kicked off last summer in Britain, people tore his statue down and threw it in the river, saying that he was involved in the slave trade and so he was a bad person. I have been trained to not pass historical judgment, moral judgment in these figures, but I don't think I agree with my training. And when it comes to this kind of thing, I think that you can and in fact should condemn people who engaged in these kind of practices for one very important reason, particularly in these kind of stories. And that reason is the issues and oppressive hierarchies and frameworks and networks that we're discussing from a historical standpoint, they still affect people today. The kinds of racism that happened 200 years ago are still happening now. And for that reason, I think it's really important to point out and condemn obviously bad things that are going on just because they're still affecting people. Maybe when we're discussing Julius Caesar and what he did to the Gauls, it's less important because no one's still affected by what Julius Caesar did to the Gauls. But here and now, racism is still really, really bad, right? So I would lean more towards the actually passing moral judgment historical actors. I'm going against my training here. If you think that I'm wrong for doing that and you have points to make, please make them. And the last thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these topics is, don't worry, guys, it's not all bad. This has been quite a heavy talk so far. There's a lot of quite sad things and serious topics. I've been almost like prematurely telling you guys off and say, oh, don't say bad things in the comments. Sure, but I should point out that there are also going to be, throughout the rest of this series, some really uplifting stories of hope and victory over oppression and injustice. And that is a continuing theme throughout all of history, that as long as there are oppressive hierarchies, there are people who will oppose them. And yes, it's true that they won't always win against these oppressive hierarchies. And in fact, some of the ones that we're talking about still haven't been beaten to this day. But people always fight, and there are always victories that are won. So don't worry, it's not all sad. I know it's depressing right now in the real world, and I understand that. I don't want to hit you with sad thing after sad thing after sad thing and make you all feel worse. But I want to emphasize that there will be happy stories in here as well. Really, genuinely, amazingly uplifting stories as well. So, to conclude, I want to give you one more picture. And this is another emphasis, I guess, further evidence for why it's so important within the modern context. You may notice that these people holding the I Am Man signs, placards, are not themselves presenting as male. That's because this picture was taken in 2018 by some students at a Southern university in the US. And it was the 50th anniversary of a march by Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Act, where they held up these I Am a Man symbols as they marched. And it really goes to show that a lot of these things aren't finally settled. But I think we can conclude from today's talk, a little bit early even, that discussing Black history is valuable and interesting. So not only is it worth doing, I think we'll all have a good time doing it and have some really interesting discussions. I think, well, I hope you guys are ready. You are kind of talked about what the scope of the series is going to be, starting way back in British colonial America and finishing like literally there will be a talk on 2020 and what the hell happened in this year in terms of the Black history of America. And I hope that we're ready to take on this history together and talk about it with rigor and compassion, and let's be thoughtful but also accurate and do some really good history and have some really good discussion. So as I said, slightly shorter talk. As it turned out, not that much shorter, because I'm very happy to ramble and go on tangents when I got the space to. That's why I keep these talks to half an hour, guys. And yeah, from the last lecture of last series, all those months ago, you may remember, I put up the painting by Jonathan Gast called American Progress that showed it was meant to be the symbol of American westward expansion. And you can see the feminine figure of America holding a school book and trailing telegraph wire behind her as the American people, plow the land and tame it and build railways and defeat the animals and Native American people as well on the frontier. What the hell's up with that? And I asked you to have a think about who was missing from this painting. Very unsurprisingly, you guys may remember, based on the topic of this period, obviously it's the Black people who in many cases did most of the actual work of American expansion against their own will. And this is the kind of thing that there's really a sense of recovering this history in the modern scholarship. They talk about how the archives don't talk about the Black history, and you have to either critically evaluate them or just use different evidence altogether when you're talking about these kinds of histories. So it's work, but it's work that's really worth doing and can open our eyes to some really interesting stories. So I would ask you guys now, do you have any questions or points to make in discussion? Normally it's like, I've talked about stuff, do you have any questions for further discussion? If you just want to make a point, that's cool too, because I think there's some interesting stuff. And I already have one. I'm going to take a sip of wine first and some water because my throat's quite dry. I can tell I haven't done this in a while, but my body isn't used to just talking long form for half an hour. But thank you guys for being here for this one. Just give me a sec. So I have one question. Agree with your very valid arguments. Thank you. Thanks. Quick question. Do you think there can be such a thing as a hierarchy that is not oppressive? That is very interesting. Before I answer that question, I should point out that I, for several years now, have been very interested in a lot of anarchist philosophy and political philosophy. And anarchist political philosophers like Proudhon and Kropotkin even, and other people, they argue that almost no hierarchies are not oppressive. And in general, they tend to be, because it's one person exerting power over others, that they are always bad. So maybe I'm not such a great person to answer that question, because I would tend to agree with that fact. And I do think that there's tends to be some degree of oppression in almost all hierarchies. Not to say that there's all of them. A really good classic example of that is when a ship is being run, you need one person to tell everyone else where to go and, what ropes to pull. This is a 19th century analogy. What ropes to pull and what, sails to man and hoist and stuff. And there needs to be some degree of organization. Otherwise, the ship just can't sail. And there are anarchist philosophers who have ways of thinking outside that, and they look at historical analogies of often pirate ships during the early 18th century, the golden age of sail, would have things where they would directly elect their captain, and the captain would be in charge as long as all the crew were happy with it. And this is a massive tangent, so I'm sorry, but it's definitely hard to say exactly. I would tend to agree that most hierarchies are to some extent oppressive, but maybe you can disagree with me. A couple of the questions. Can we judge behavior of people over 100 years ago when they were reflecting the society they lived in, the norm at the time, no matter how reprehensible we view it now? That is the really, that's the classic counterpoint. And I think that's not to say, calling it classic, I'm not insulting it at all. I think it's a really good point. But I disagree with it. Because say in the, it's 1800, slavery and the slave trade is legal in almost every polity in the world. However, the people who experience slavery aren't in favor of it, unsurprisingly, right? These people argued against it and wrote against it and all that kind of thing. And they were always against it. So I think it's not the case that in this ex-historical time period, but everyone thought it was fine, therefore we shouldn't fault someone for thinking that it's fine, because it's never true that everyone thought it was fine. That's the point. It's always worth mentioning. Maybe even in popular discourse of the white philosophers, they all thought that slavery was okay in the late 17th century, which incidentally isn't true. For most of the time that there's been slavery, there have been people who have been against it. Even then, the people who experienced it were against it. So that's why I think that you can criticize those people. And maybe that means that you criticize most people in history as being racist. And maybe that seems extreme, but I think it's just true, right? I think it just has to be the case that most people in the past did have beliefs that we think are wrong. And that's why I think we shouldn't have the default point that everyone's perfect and then find it horrifying when there are disagreements with that, and you have to point out, oh, this person actually had sexist beliefs, this person had racist beliefs, this person had homophobic beliefs, and so on. We should understand that most people are wrong in some ways, and that's still true today. I think most people are wrong in some ways. I'm wrong in some ways, right? No one's perfect at all. And so I would say that we can call those beliefs and practices reprehensible, even if they were commonplace at the time. There are commonplace beliefs and practices that happen right now on this planet that I think are reprehensible, and I think a lot of people would agree with me are. Another question. Do you know if Black history is better known and understood in the US than the UK? That's a really good question. I think that it is the case. Partly because the sheer fact that there are a lot more Black people in the US than there are in the UK, both by proportion and by sheer numbers. But I don't think that's enough of an answer. And I think that in the US, there is a lot more open discussion about racism and a lot more open discussion about historical racism. Whereas in Britain, people do tend to kind of brush it under the rug and just say, oh, in America, everyone's really racist, but in Britain, it's all fine, when that's just not the case. And people who I've talked to who are from ethnic minorities, my friends, they say that they still experience racism in Britain, and it's not just all fine here. So I suspect that it's partly there's more people in the US, but partly they'll just talk about it more in the US. And so I think that the Black history and the history of oppressions are more known in America than in the UK, for sure. Yeah. I have a question. Should you not start with African history? Maybe, yes. And actually, a lot of my focus in uni has been on African history as well. But if I did that, we'll be here all day, I guess. It would be my most basic answer. We were talking about African history in part in this time. There'll be some mentions of it. But I think it's such a different topic. And in fact, I really would say there's a really big difference between Black people who live in Africa and Black people who are in the diaspora who live elsewhere in the world. There's like a really sharp cultural divide between those people. And there's things that unify them. And there's a lot of interesting discussion to be had about that topic. But I would say that it's so different that I will probably do another series later after the Black History of America that's just African history. And I think they're just different topics entirely. I have another question, which is, are you aware that one of the main founders of a colony where enslaved people were first brought to in 1526 was also called Lucas? I am not sure if I've heard that or not. Maybe I have. That rings a vague bell. And I apologize on behalf of Lucas's, I guess. It's probably, I'm guessing, like a Spanish guy who did it. That is a weird coincidence. Actually, that does ring a bell. I'm doing a module as we speak on Atlantic history. So it talks about Africa, Europe, South America, North America. That is the wrong way around. South America, North America. And I'm trying to remember, and I think that guy might have had his name mentioned. But no, I didn't know off the top of my head. So thank you for pointing that out, I guess. I think that is interesting, actually, that there's these names are used again and again and again. Are there any other questions at all? You don't need to be afraid. I think we're having good discussion already, and I'm happy to call it here. There's no crisis if no one else says anything. But either on YouTube, we've had one really good question from YouTube, and if anyone else has any questions on Zoom or YouTube, go for it. I'm gonna drink some more water. If not, then no. Here we go. Here's a bit of a question if you have time. Of course I have time. The Black Lives Matter movement has vandalized statues of many historical figures, from awful racists to people who were, it could be said, racist because everyone was. Let us say, this is going to be a really juicy question that I could talk about for hours, I suspect. Let us say in 500 years, the world is post-capitalist, post-economy, and they look back on capitalism as an awful oppression. Should they tear down statues of the great people of our generation simply because they were capitalists? Now, here is my searing hot take on this topic. I really don't believe that we should put up statues to people at all. And if you want to have a go at me in the comments, please do. I'd love to have the discussion now, because there was, when you put a statue up to someone, you are creating historical memory about them, and you are really limiting what people know about this person. What they know about someone when they see a statue is this figure, an inscription underneath that has their name, you know what they look like, and you get 3 sentences of who they were. And based on that, people form opinions about someone. And that is the purpose of a statue, right? Is to memorialize people and to commemorate them. But it also idealizes them. And I think that when you create a statue, you are saying, this is a person who is worthy of recognition. And you are literally putting them on a pedestal. That's exactly what it means when you make a statue of someone. And no one is perfect, all right? And this means that there will always be something wrong with almost everyone in the world. And so I think that it's this flaw in humanity almost, that we really want to have heroes. And so we really want to think of some people as perfect when it's just not possible. So I would say that that's a really good question about should we tear people down as being capitalists. And there's a Proudhon quote where he says, "I would long for the day when I was guillotined as a conservative," him being one of the most radical people in this period. And about to feed on to the question I've just been asked. Famously, Proudhon actually, some of his beliefs were incredibly sexist. And so he probably would have been not guillotined, he would have been cancelled as a conservative now if he had survived to this day. And so I think it's worth mentioning, like, no one's perfect. Even the most radical people still hold some very conservative beliefs. So I think, we just shouldn't put up these statues to people in the first place. I have a question. Will you be covering the history from a woman's perspective? So many fascinating people in Black history are overlooked for their achievements simply because they're women. Really, very, very true. I completely agree with you. And yes, I will absolutely be looking at a lot of the really interesting women from this topic. Rosa Parks is, of course, the most famous one, but there are a lot more people that really shaped their time periods and had a lot of influence every and any step of American history in this time point. And yes, as you say, often overlooked simply because they're women. I think there are some really, really fascinating stories to tell, particularly about Black women in this time period. So yes, good point to bring up. And yes, I absolutely will be covering that kind of history. Not only the like legends, the Titanic figures, the Rosa Parkses. It's also worth. I think I'm going to have at least one talk, maybe 2, on, I guess, the mechanics and mechanisms of slavery and what was it like to be a slave, an enslaved person, should I say? I'm not perfect. I get this kind of thing wrong all the time. Like, don't worry if you get the language wrong a little bit. If you make an honest mistake, it's all good. And there's some really, really interesting discourse about the difference between what it was like to be an enslaved woman and what it was like to be an enslaved man. And also, at every step of the way, what it's the differences in oppression, the difference in hierarchies, and all this kind of intersectional. It's really, really interesting stuff, basically. So yes, I absolutely will be covering history from women's perspective, and of course, especially Black women's perspective here. So yes, if there are any other questions, please go for it. I'm nearly at the end of my wine, so that's a good sign. But if not, then I'd like to say thank you very much, everyone who stuck around for the talk and also came for the questions afterwards. We seem to have grown an audience since then. So thank you very much for that. I would like to say, and this is the first time ever doing it, so my heart's pounding as I say this. Please do consider telling other people about this series. I would kind of like to grow this channel a little bit and spread the word around and get some more audience, because I'd like to think that this is a really interesting topic. And not only that, nothing to do with me. I think this is just valuable discussion and valuable stuff for people to talk about. I think that I've got mainly a British audience and people don't know about this kind of history. If you study history at school, I was never told about it at school. I had to really find these modules at university to learn about this kind of thing. So before I sign off for the day, and thank you guys all so much for I'm so excited for the rest of these talks because we've already had amazing discussion, really good questions from everyone. Thank you so much for that. Please do consider sharing it around, telling your mates, spread this, and let's try and grow the channel a little bit if we can together. But we'll be back in 2 weeks' time, in a fortnight, and we're going to be talking about the first colonies on America and why and how very, very quickly African people began to be brought across the Atlantic to work as enslaved people. Thank you, everyone, very, very much. And I'll see you in 2 weeks. It's good to be back. And I hope that you guys agree with me. Stay healthy, everyone.
Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you very much.
you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
All.
Thank you very much. Most interesting. Looking forward to it, to more.